Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we're talking about death in Supernatural. In fact, not only does it happen in the show, there's a whole book about it, and we're going to talk with the authors today. Oh, and Susan's got a copy right there for show and tell. So before we get going, I'd love to have my wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Susan.
Well, I'm Susan Nylander, and I am a professor at Barstow College, the little college out in the California desert. And Mandy and I are supernatural fanatics, Aka fandomatics, I think is kind of, she'll say it right when it's her turn. But yeah, Mandy and I have been, had a scholarly interest in supernatural, as well as a fan interest in supernatural for quite a number of years now. And we have had a wonderful opportunity to work on this book. Mandy can talk a little bit more too about how the book came about. We talk about that pretty much in depth in the introduction to the book. It started as a scholarly academic panel paper that we cooperated on. But anyway, big fans of the show, big fans of being scholars about the show. And we're thrilled with the book, and we hope that others are as well.
Cool. Mandy?
My name is Mandy Taylor. I am currently an instructional designer at California State University, San Bernardino, and that just means I help faculty with instructional technologies in their courses. I also used to teach English at the same university. And so I do have an academic background. I call us ACA fans of Supernatural, academic fans. I think I stole that from Lynn at some point or something like that. Or I've adopted it. I don't know if it's stolen so much. When we get to the storytelling of how the book came about, happy to say how that came about. It's kind of Susan's fault that I got into Supernatural to begin with. So yeah, I binged 7 seasons worth in a summer, and then we went from season 8 on, episode by episode, and we'll hold off on the rest for a little bit later. But that's kind of where we started in 2014 with a collaborative paper, and it grew into a book.
Very cool. Lynn?
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I am a licensed psychologist and a professor at Westchester University. I did not coin the term ACAFan. I stole it from Henry Jenkins, and you stole it from me. We're just passing it along, so that's totally fine. My research area is studying fandom, and my favorite show is Supernatural, so that means that many of my books combine fandom and supernatural. The last 2 books that I've done have been written with the actors and the fans of Supernatural, so that's Family Don't End with Blood. Got a pretty cover with Sam and Dean on it. Jensen, Jared, Misha, most of the actors wrote for that. And then, look, it's double now. I'm surrounded by it. There'll be Peace When You Are Done is the most recent book, and that's about the ending of the show and the legacy that the show leaves behind, also written by the actors and the fans.
Awesome. And I'm Gail Z. Martin. I write, as Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, near future, post-apocalyptic, and more. As Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. I fell in love with Supernatural halfway through season 11, binge watched 11 seasons in 4 months, so I would be ready to live tweet at the beginning of season 12, as one does, which is how I got to know Lynn and the folks over at Winchester Family Business, for whom I'm now a staff columnist. And I have a chapter in There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, which I'm immensely proud of having the chance to do. And now I run a fan group on Facebook, as well as the fandom track here at Continual. So this is what the show will do to you in a wonderful, wonderful way. But so Mandy, you were saying that there's a story here on how the book came about, Death in Supernatural. Spill the beans. Come on, that's what we're here for.
So in 2014, Susan and I went to Southwest Popular Culture, American Culture, SWPACA, conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And our paper was on death, specifically death himself, and supernatural, kind of how he came to be. One of my favorite scenes in the entire series is Death's entrance in 2 Minutes to Midnight. And so it's like, I think my words to Susan was like, I love Death. He's awesome. It's like, don't you just love death? And it's like, that's a really weird thing to say if taken out of context. It's not usually, people just don't quite think
I got
that.
it.
Usually, yeah, she understood. Like, we understood. So I think I watched that episode by myself. That was part of my homework of catching up with the series. And so Susan's like, let me know when you meet this character. So we decided we needed to write, and we found a home at Wapaka. And then after that panel, we're just like, I think there's a book here, and that kind of grew in the next couple years or so. In 2016, it's like, yeah, we have a book, let's do a book. Who can we have help us do a book? And we were directed to McFarland Publishers, who published our book, and talked to Layla Milholland, and it's like, yeah, okay, let's get a book together. And it became a 2.5 year odyssey of putting everything together and getting it published, and step by step. And it's like, hey, we have a cover. The cover was awesome, but we couldn't share it for a while. And then getting all of that together, and our contributors. Lynn was gracious enough to connect us with Julian Richings, who played Death, the first Death. And still one of my favorite incarnations of Death ever in anything I've ever seen. And so he wrote our foreword, and Lynn wrote our afterword to kind of wrap everything together. And that is the mini story of our book. And Susan can talk about more aspects of it as desired.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is how we came to this series. We didn't start with the series from episode 1, and there's multiple reasons for that, I think. But one of them is that we were in grad school together at the time, and that'll do a number on you.
That explains so much right there.
but yeah, it was funny because by the time I came across episodes on TNT, and so I started seeing an episode here or there, and I went, this might not be as awful as I thought it was going to be. And maybe that was me going, oh, it's too young for me, or I just didn't know. I didn't think it would be me until I really watched an episode and went, oh my gosh, look at the way these guys are using music. The way they were using music in the show is part of what just dragged me in and wouldn't let go of me. And so then I had to go back and I watched from the beginning and got quite a ways in. I don't know if I'd finished it all completely up to that point because it was in season 7. I had to actually buy season 7 on Amazon so that I could finish it that summer, the streaming, so I could finish it by the time season 8 began. And, Mandy is my favorite colleague to bounce these kinds of things off of. And so I don't know why I just thought I have to talk to someone about this. And so I made Mandy come up to my house, and I think we watched the pilot, and we watched the pilot episode and the final episode of season 1. Mm-hmm. And I filled her in on all the important stuff that she needed to know, not overly so, but enough. And then we watched the first episode of season 2. Mm-hmm. And then we watched the final 2 seasons of episode 2, which is All Hell Breaks Loose, parts 1 and 2. And so that was her introduction to the show. So I said, you need to at least get this, because I knew that once I didn't know that if the pilot would grab her enough. So I'm like, no, you have to see the arc. You have to see the story arc. And so and you've got to hear the music. You've got to hear how they use the music. And so that was a big part. And then the rest of it, she was like, okay. So then she went. So then we were mostly texting back and forth or emailing back and forth about the show as she was catching up, and I was catching up through that summer as well. So, you know, pretty much we watched 7 seasons in pretty quick succession in order to watch season 8 when it began, which was a whole different experience going week to week. And that's really hard when you've gotten used to watching one after the other after the other. And then I got into the habit too of having, when I was home in the mornings, especially in the summer, I don't know if I was teaching then that summer, but I would let TNT run. They would run like 4 episodes. And so even if I'd seen the episodes, I'd let it kind of run in the background while I was doing other things. And that again, just helped me collect all of where I could do the dialogue in my sleep. And I knew what was coming next and all of that. So really it was that. And then once we did the first panel at SWAPACA, and the death panel, there you go. But once we did that, then the next year we decided to do a roundtable on use of the music in the show. And in fact, that's where we met Lynn. Lynn came and live tweeted our roundtable on the music. And we had another colleague, Gina, who came in with us on that roundtable. And that was just phenomenal. And I think we really enjoyed doing that. And then I think that was when Mandy and I decided, yeah, this is kind of our scholarly calling at the moment. And we really worked on trying to build up a supernatural studies area for SWAPACA. And that's sort of our reason for being now, at least for some of us.
What Susan and Mandy are known for at Southwest Popular Culture Association, I'm the area chair for Stardom and Fandom there. So I'm there every year. So I see them every year. And what they're really known for is putting together this amazing supernatural viewing party where we play trivia games, and they've always got supernatural prizes, and we watch episodes, and they always bring pie, these little tiny mini pies that are so delicious. And it's like when you're at an academic conference, it's interesting, but some of it is, a little dry and you're tired. So it's always nice at the end of the night to go to Susan and Mandy's supernatural party and get back into the real fandom fun of it.
So I'm intrigued by the book on so many levels. And one of them is that, modern Americans really shy away from death. Oh, we have a kitty. It's a real panel because we have a Goldie.
This is Goldie.
Pretty kitty. Americans shy away from death. We outsource it. We no longer have a wake in the parlor because that's become the living room. We die in hospitals. We get moved away in unmarked vans to somewhere else where we can, have a viewing, and then it's completely sanitized. And in Supernatural, it's gritty and up close, and people are digging up graves and burning bodies and having pyres and finding remains. And that is very different from anything in the experience of modern Americans. How does that play into the significance of death in the show? Because so many of those pieces are right up there in your face every episode.
Well, and Mandy can jump in and talk to this too in a moment. I was going to say that I did my master's thesis on death Walt Whitman, elegy, death, melancholy, 19th century death and melancholy. And I actually covered some of that history, that building of the funerary industry.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to the Civil War, death was a very intimate experience that most people had. It was a domestic duty that women had for laying out the dead and, doing all of the preparation. And it was a community effort. And it was very, very, part of life. And it was a very intimate part of life because you could die very easily from a cut finger. There were no antibiotics in the 19th century. There were accidents and women died in childbirth consistently, it seemed like. So death was ever present, but with the rise of the funerary industry and all of that came after the Civil War, death became much more distant. It became industrialized. It became a profession, and it was something that we could keep at arm's length. And it wasn't something we were intimate with. And so I talk a lot about that in my essay in the death book about that. We also have another contributor who talks about that as well, and how death, it's so easy these days to deny death, to keep it at arm's length, to, as I say in one point, whistle past the graveyard, because it's behind closed doors. And so, yeah, Supernatural does put it up in our face in a very real and very visceral way in some ways. And so I think that part of why we wanted to look at the book, or we wanted to look at the subject matter in the book, was to show how the series helps us sort of reconcile and with that a little bit more. But yeah, it's really easy for us, I think, because it's behind closed doors so often.
Mm-hmm. Mandy?
So for me, one of the intriguing parts of this was that you do have to confront death with the Winchesters over and over again. Like they die, yes, but they come back because of that resurrection. They're going to go through it again. And in Mystery Spot specifically, when you see Dean die so many times and Sam continually has to come to terms with this, and then so do we. We can't escape seeing that happen. And in the course of the series, for me personally, there were some losses that I had to come to terms with. And some of the episodes where just to see Sam particularly grieving Dean and re-grieving John at some points helped me to face some of my own death issues, I guess, so to speak. Like you can't not watch the show and have things come up, I think, at some point. And what was really interesting to me is that they had an actual personification of death in the show, that, death, and he's not necessarily villainous per se, but he's something that Dean wants to fight, that we have, if they both want to fight in some respects, that you have this person that now becomes the center of your ire. And there's this realization that you can't really fight it. There's this natural order that needs to be preserved in some fashion. And as much as we rail against it, and in Dylan Thomas, we rage against the dying of the light, that light's going to die. And how do we come to terms with it? And that's part of what I wanted to explore as well.
Old Death is almost terrifying because of his neutrality, because he isn't an easy villain. He's just death.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, one of my favorite moments in the show, one of my favorite lines is when Sam says, well, you kind of have to care about us a little bit. And Death turns around and says, I really don't. and that's so brilliant, because truly he doesn't. Mandy brought up too, our own personal, I took care of my mom and dad. My mom and dad were on hospice. In fact, the first year the show started, that's part of maybe why I didn't watch it the first year, because I was a little busy taking care of my folks and starting grad school. But so many episodes do, like Mandy said, they touch on personal things. Regarding Dean, that was sort of even though it wasn't a death in a way, but my mom had Alzheimer's. And the last few years taking care of her was a death. It was a long, prolonged death. And so when I watched that episode, it just really, I don't think there were enough boxes of tissues for me on that one, Lynn, because it just brought so many things back up. And so I think that's part of why we look at why we look at this in particular, because it touches on our daily lives, ourselves, our experiences, and we can relate to things, but also, again, it helps us deal a little bit as well. I didn't really want to go back and revisit my mom's, dementia, but it helped me in some ways to see, this moment that Sam was grieving for Dean, that he was losing inch by inch. And I think anyone who knows what that's like, and that really is, you lose the person inch by inch. So it's prolonged death, and it's horrible.
And he even tells Rowena that he's seen Dean die several times, and losing him like this is worse.
Yes.
Lynn, how about you?
You can't.
Oh, we lost you completely.
We can't hear you at all.
Can't hear me at all.
There we go. Okay.
Hey, there we go. Might need to lean into it.
I'm so sorry, people who are watching this, like to have my face like so big, but my laptop is like not being very nice tonight. I was going to say that the thing that I like about Supernatural, and the thing that I think makes it so powerful, is that it doesn't flinch from looking at these things in a way that is not always pleasant when you're watching. I mean, from the very beginning in season 1, Kripke would put an episode on that just like yanked your heart out, and everybody would go online afterwards on LiveJournal and put up an icon saying, "Damn you, Kripke," or, because it wasn't pleasant, but it is therapeutic. It's, we're facing these things that are really hard for us to face in real life. And yet, like Susan said, things that we really do face in real life, including death. And it's easier to face them with a little bit of distance, a little bit of projection in fiction and in media. And I think Supernatural has done us a great favor in not flinching away from those things right up until the very end. I mean, the last episode, some of it was very, very hard to watch, but that's kind of what I was expecting the end of Supernatural to be about. I didn't expect it to flinch. I expected it, for us to have to deal with the deaths of these two men who had cheated death so many times. And I was sort of sad that the book Death in Supernatural was already done.
I
I
know.
mean, you need
Volume
to have
2.
a new edition, because there's so much to say about that finale and what the finale and those last few episodes have to say about death, including 18 with Castiel, 19, and then 20 with Winchester. It would fit right in for another couple chapters.
Well, and I think we even say in the conclusion, we say, really, this is just the beginning. There's so much more that could be written. We've just kind of put our toe in the water, and yeah, I think we could do a volume 2, Mandy.
Well, in some ways, our cultural squeamishness about death makes death one of the monsters.
Yeah.
Because while it is a part of life, we haven't seen it in that way for so long that it has become something alien and separate. And that's something that's interesting when you look at how frequently the Winchesters confront it. And I saw in the book, and I've seen other folks who focus on ghost stories mention this as well, that our ghost stories say a lot about our what our social constructs and our social fears and our social turning points and touchstones. And we certainly have enough ghost stories in Supernatural. So how does that tie into this whole concept of death? The dead that just won't stay dead.
I think from a psychological perspective, I think I wrote about this in the afterword, actually, because it struck me that so many of the chapters touched on this. But, one of the things that we do through our media is confront things that we don't want to confront. The fact that death is a reality means that we want to sort of fight against that. Hence, ghosts who come back, and vampires who refuse to die, and zombies who keep coming back to life. So a lot of the monsters in Supernatural, a lot of the things that they're fighting are really sort of representations of death. And just the fact that the Winchesters fight against them, and then also are willing to do just about anything to bring each other back to life when they die. I mean, the show really has a lot to say about how afraid we are in this modern culture about death. And like Gail said, how much we've kind of demonized it and sort of made it into a monster. Very different than, like Susan said, back in the day when it was a part of life and something that we really didn't fear.
Yeah. Well, we might have feared it, but we did, but we knew, I mean, I touch on it in my chapter about the good death. I mean, there were traditions built up around death and dying and grief, and people had, it was codified in a way. They had a toolbox to use. People would wear black armbands. Women would wear the black veil. There would be, if the house was in mourning, you'd see a black wreath on the door. So there were these outward expressions of grief that we don't have today. And I noticed it, really when I was writing my my thesis about this, about how people could see if someone was grieving. So you had, oh, I'm going to be more tender with this person. I'm going to be a little more gentle with this person because they've suffered a loss. We go, stand next to somebody in line at, Target. We don't know if they've suffered a loss. I felt that kind of keenly as I was going through taking care of my folks. My parents died at home. And so, my dad literally in my arms. And so how I got a taste of that intimacy that I don't know if I was prepared for it ever, but it taught me something about how to confront it and how to deal with it and how to move past it. Not like it's gone, but I mean, I can deal with it now after all these years. But I was really working through a lot of grief. When I wrote my thesis, I deal with a lot of, and grief comes up when you least expect it sometimes. Again, watching regarding Dean, that was so, I didn't expect the grief to come up for me to that degree. I mean, there for a while, I'd break down and cry in the juice section because I'd see cran grape. That was what my parents drank. So, grief doesn't have a timeline. And so I think having models to look at might help when we watch, a show like Supernatural, where they do deal with grief. I think Mandy's essay in particular was sort of a study of 3 different deaths and grief processes. And I think that is really, really helpful if people are looking for, wow, am I doing this right? This grief thing. Yeah, you probably are. There's no right or wrong way, and there's no timeline. But I think if we could go back to some kind of a tradition where we have some kind of an outward expression, it would, I think, go a long way to people being a little more gentle with one another, perhaps.
I've said that at several times when I've been in periods of loss myself, in that, if you're Jewish, you can sit Shiva, and people, there is a social community expectation and a framework. If you're Catholic, you can light candles and have novenas said. You have something to do. If you're Protestant, you're left feeling like there should be something to do, and you're just supposed to be happy they're in a better place. And honestly, that doesn't cut it. So I always end up going over to the nearest Catholic church and lighting candles because I've got to do something. And I think you're very right. All of those death rituals are for the people left behind, not the dead themselves.
Right.
And when we remove all of those rituals, it leaves the living not only bereaved, but kind of left flat-foot, like, what now? And at least in Supernatural, they can give somebody a hunter's funeral, which is, like you said, so intimate. They have to take care of the body. They have to shroud the body. They have to build the pyre. That's extremely intimate and remarkably gentle for a roughshod community. Mandy, your thoughts?
I think some of what drew me to was in the finale, the giving the permission. Like, you got to tell me it's okay.
Mhm.
They've been fighting for so long, and even Sam on his deathbed when he was aged, like it's okay. It's like, you can rest, and you can rest. It's we're fine. And sometimes that often that when we're not able to sit vigil, we're able to give that permission to ourselves and to the dying, because often the dying is done away and out of our sight. We lose that piece of that ritual. So I sat vigil with a nephew. I wasn't there when he passed away, but we were there for about 2 or 3 days while he was actively leaving this world. He was not very, well, he's 17 when he passed. And so just to watch that, and that sounds morbid, but just to be there and to be in the atmosphere in the home. And he was able to die at home with his family, which doesn't always happen or often happen. And then just feeling there. It was a very moving spiritual experience, regardless of religious belief system. But it's just to be there, to know how kind of that line, I guess, between death and life, it's very thin at times. And to be able to see and hear, we couldn't see, but to hear about what my nephew could see while he was transitioning, so to speak, who he called out for, what he said, when he was able to speak, was an experience that I hadn't really thought of really until kind of going through. I mean, I thought about it, but it came up again, much like Susan was talking about, to give that permission to go. And that was kind of what the last day or so of his life was like. We'll be okay. Go ahead. And so to have that as kind of the final moments of the show was a reminder of that's some of the final moments that I hope to be able to give to those around me, either when I go or when I sit vigil with my loved ones, if I can.
That whole concept of accompanying the departing, either as a reaper or, as it's usually referred to, as a psychopomp, happens a lot in Supernatural. The reapers escort the dead, but in some ways, Sam and Dean serve as psychopomps in bringing the dead to an understanding that it's time to move on. And I'm thinking about Phantom Traveler, where they explain that it's okay. Now you just have to let go. Anything to say about that idea of being the one who accompanies?
You know, in the 19th century, again, people felt that the living could be instructed by the dead in a lot of ways. That's again, I talk about the rise of the rural cemetery movement, which was begun by a group of horticulturalists in Massachusetts. And so the creation of these cemeteries that are beautiful and artistic and have these wonderful monuments and have these places where people could sit and be contemplative with the dead, and that they were somehow going to be instructed, you know, that you could learn because of, you know, the people that had gone before. And so I think in that sense, yeah. And I'm also thinking about how the reapers, they really don't make a lot of judgment other than, no, you have to go now. You know, I mean, Tessa is as gentle with that armed robber when Dean is playing death. Tessa's as gentle with him, it's time to go, as the guy who falls over from the heart attack, as the little girl. She's the same gentle guiding, taking them, you know, to wherever they're supposed to go. And so she's not making a real judgment, but she takes them where they're supposed to be. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing too, that they tend to be as neutral as the boss in a way, you know. So I think that the episode 2, what was it called, about roadkill, when the ghost, she doesn't know she's dead. and they keep having to keep that from her. They
Mhm.
don't, but it's like they have one night. And so when they do confront her with the fact that she's dead, that again, it's that gentle, yes, I think they serve that purpose really well, like you were saying, Gail. As-
Lynn, we can't hear
Lynn,
you.
we can't hear you.
Please, I keep forgetting. Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Yes.
Now I sound like that commercial. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
that just goes with Zoom meetings.
You don't think of Supernatural as being like a comforting show, but you know, there's a lot in it that is very comforting around death. I mean, you're right, sort of the way they portray the Reaper. I can think we all want to think that we won't sort of be alone and afraid, that there'll be somebody to kind of accompany us, somebody who's not judgmental, who's gentle with us to accompany us. And I think also, I was thinking when you guys were talking, you know, many people have never seen anyone die, have never witnessed anyone die, because we don't see it very often anymore. I have several times, you guys are talking about, you have, and it did do a lot to sort of quell my own fear to be with a loved one when they were dying, and to be able to witness it, and to be able to be there and to hold their hand, etc. And I really like that in the end of Supernatural, they allowed that to happen for Sam and Dean. I mean, for hunters, even Dean, I mean, yes, that was a violent death, but it was also a sort of a strikingly peaceful death. Dean was not suicidal. He did not want to die, but when he knew that he was dying, he was very unafraid and very accepting, and just wanted to convey to Sam the things that were important for him to tell his brother before he left. And then for him to get that permission, that reassurance that Sam would be okay, which would let him go. And then Sam, when he was going, he got the same thing from his son. You know, he wanted that reassurance that it was okay to go. He didn't go by himself. He was loved. He was in his room with all the family photographs and his son holding his hand. So I don't think I expected the Winchesters to get as peaceful deaths as they did, even though that sounds strange for Supernatural. But I think that was nice for humans who, modern humans who have so much fear about death, to witness kind of those peaceful deaths happening.
Mandy, anything to add to that?
No.
One of the things, I know you had a chapter about death signaling a change in character, a change in narrative, and that comes up so often. Yellow Eyes taunts, you know, are you sure that what came back was 100% Sammy? Dean coming back from purgatory changed. Sam coming back soulless. You know, and Dean coming back from hell changed. What about that in the show, and as a well, let's just start with, tell me what brought that up to warrant its chapter, and where you took that.
Well, that I think is we had a couple different contributors who wrote about that. I think Aaron's was about signaling narrative shifts, but we also had someone who talked about every time that they came back, they were different. They were moving. Now I have to cheat and look at the text to get that chapter. But it was how each time they came back, they were really the evolution. Okay, death, resurrection, and the monstrous evolution of the Winchesters. Jessica wrote that one. And that was, yeah, she looked at how the Winchesters came back a little less human in a way, a little more monstrous. All right, move. she was trying to get out from under the desk. So they came back a little bit different. So yeah, I think their deaths do signal a transition of some kind, or some kind of an evolution in their characters.
So, all the way up to Dean coming back as a full demon.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say too that you really can't go through death and remain unchanged unless, I mean, in some fashion. and especially in a series where there's no other way to signal a character shift really, is that, they've gone through this death and how many times they've died and how many times they've seen it. You can't be the same. Even if you're fighting the same fight, there's going to be some nuance about you that's different. I mean, we have the shift from the black and white, all monsters gotta die, from Dean to like, hey, now we're working with Crowley and Rowena and other demons, and we're making these alliances that early season Dean would have been like, yeah, no, kill them all. Whereas, kind of, especially after season 10, after Demon Dean, there's this wrestling. It's like, well, okay, we work with who we got to work with, and especially then when finding out, Jack/God is our final boss, so to speak, final villain. Now we're taking on everybody, and everybody comes back, and he brings back all of the enemies and all of the things they have to fight them all again. And the Winchesters are ready, possibly because they've died so often. They know what to do. I mean, they know how to. What else? What do you have to lose? We've died before. The only thing that can happen is that we don't come back this time.
It didn't take.
Yeah. Like there's really nothing else to be afraid of. But now we're angry with realizing that all of this has been a machination. And we've been in this cage, so to speak. We've been running this race that really isn't ours. And so death is this way to kind of help renew the fight. I think to come back with this new perspective and this new way to now what, or in preparation perhaps, of fighting this new villain or the new fight and finding another way around what's coming, so to speak.
Lynn?
Can't hear you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be right on top of people. It's almost like, so much of the show was about fighting against death and, not making death permanent and subverting it in some way and finding all these ways to come back no matter what the cost was. And then finally, in the end, really, some of the we are no longer puppets of Chuck. Some of that was, and now, we're back to the natural order. And part of that natural order is we are going to die. We, the Winchesters, just like everyone else, are going to die. Like that, weirdly, almost death in the end is like part of the victory, right?
Yeah.
Because they're no longer puppets and now they can die. Not that they wanted to die. I know there's people out there who are like, Dean was suicidal. No, he was definitely not suicidal, but that is part of the natural order of things. And that was sort of restored in the end, which I think was kind of a beautiful ending for the show.
Well, folks, we're only about halfway through my list of questions. So I'm really hoping that I can convince you to come back for part 2, because
Absolutely.
There's so much left on my list. And this is such a fertile topic when it comes to supernatural. Before we go, let's have a quick chance for you to tell people where to find you online. Susan, starting with you.
Well, you can find our text, Death and Supernatural, Critical Essays. You can find that at McFarlane, and you can also find it on Amazon. I don't really have a site or a web presence per se, but the Death and Supernatural, we do still have Death and Supernatural at gmail.com. If anyone has questions or is interested about that too. I'm going to mute myself. Stop.
Mandy?
I'm the same as Susan. I don't have a widespread online presence. We are on Twitter. I think it's Death and SPN is our Twitter handle. I'm Eli Zona on Twitter. I'm not highly active at this point, but if anybody reaches out, I'm happy to talk about and tag us in any death and supernatural things. We'll find it. An email is always good.
Awesome. Lynn?
I am everywhere on social media at FangasmSPN. You can find There Will Be Peace When You Are Done and Family Don't End with Blood on Amazon or at my website, fangasmthebook.com, or on the book's website, peacewhenyouaredone.com.
And you can find me at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com, Supernatural TFWNC on Facebook, but mostly you can find me here at Continual. Well, thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for spending time with us and taking on this terrific topic. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. We'll have more Supernatural coming up here on Continual, so we'll see you online.